in the class last week. I apologize that we didn't get very far, and I talked real fast trying to get through. So I told everybody we'd just start over. So that's good news and bad news. So if you didn't get to hear it, maybe that might be good news. If you did, you have to hear it twice. I apologize. So, but we will get through with our lessons. We got this week and 2 more, I believe, left in this series, and I think we can probably combine them and get through what we need to. But again, appreciate you being here tonight. Before we get started, I'm going to ask Brother Barker, if he will, to lead us in opening prayer.
Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for the great day. We thank you for the sunshine. We thank you for the opportunity to come together to study from thy word tonight. Father, we ask that you would be with and bless our teacher as he directs the thoughts in the lesson. And Father, we know there are many that are sick that need the touch of your healing hand. And Father, we pray that you would bless them. We know that there's many families that have lost loved ones. And Father, be with them, comfort them as well. We thank you for our country and our freedom, and we continue to pray for our country. And as we enter the new week, Father, we pray that you would be with us, guide us, and protect us as our prayer in Christ's name. Amen.
All right, again, thank you for being with us tonight. Our lesson is Lesson 8, and the title is Nathaniel, Purely Prejudiced. If you didn't get a sheet, there are some in the back there to help you guide along. So hopefully that will somehow said that helps them in their study, so hopefully that will be something that can take advantage of. We are on our 6th apostle. We have been through Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, and tonight, like I said, we're on Nathaniel. Nathaniel is listed by 2 names. We see him called Nathaniel sometimes Bartholomew. But he was, or his name, Nathaniel, literally means God had given, or a gift from God. He's listed as Bartholomew in all 4 lists of the 12, but in John he's called Nathaniel. And there's been some who would argue that was 2 different people, but I think that's pretty well been established that it's the same guy. The Bartholomew, where does that name come from? Well, that's his surname. We like Bar Jonah, Bar Jesus, whatever. But Bar meaning son of Ptolemy, so Nathaniel Bartolome. So that is a patronymic name. So last week, that's a big word I learned last week, so I try to use it in a sentence. But it literally means identifies with the Father. So if your name is Johnson or Peterson, same way we use those in our way of naming people today. Same thing that meant in those days. So that is the subject of our lesson tonight. The Synoptic Gospels, those first 3, and Acts, as far as that goes, really contains no details about this guy, about his background, about his character, about his personality. In fact, only mentions him twice. Once where they list him with the 12 there, and then John in 2 passages. In John chapter 1, where his call is recorded, and then in John chapter 21 and 2, where he's named as one of those who returned to Galilee and went fishing with Peter. So in total, we only find 7 verses in the New Testament dedicated to Nathaniel. However, as I said last week, ran across the saying, says, a great view can be seen through a window with only 7 panes. So if you like to watch HGTV and all those where they design houses and all that, I saw one recently where they were building a house and the whole house was built around the view. So it had this beautiful view, and they had a big picture window looking out over that, and so everything was based off of that. So this lesson, based on those 7 panes there, those 7 verses, where we can learn a whole lot about the nature of Nathaniel. But where did he come from? Well, he was a small-town guy from Galilee, like our others, from the town of Canaan, a place where Jesus did his first miracle, changing water to wine. Also was very close to Jesus' own hometown of Nazareth, not very far apart at all. And we do know here that as far as relationships go, that he was brought to Jesus by Philip. Right after Philip was called by Christ, he went straight and found his friend and told him about him, and we're going to get into that a little bit later. But they were apparently close friends. Every time we see the list listed, he is always right there with Philip. First 2 was 2 sets of brothers, and then these 2 guys who seemed to be close friends. So whether that relationship they had was business, whether they were in fishing business together, whether they were schoolmates or family relationships or just social neighbors, whatever, we don't know. Scripture doesn't tell us that, but they were obviously very close and knew each other very well. Matter of fact, we know, there's some of that from the fact that when Philip was called, he obviously knew that Nathanael would want to know this too. So that's why he went straight to him. And, he couldn't wait to share the good news there with Nathanael and what insight he had there. So that tells us a lot about his character in general. All right, so point number 2 of our lesson there was his love of Scripture. It's another thing we can find out here about Nathanael. It was obvious from how Philip announced to him that he had found the Messiah that he studied the Scripture. It says in John 1:45, Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote." So he knew he would be interested, but he also knew that he had been studying, and he knew to be looking for Jesus because of what they had studied here in the law and also in the prophets. He had been prophesied about in the Old Testament, and if you knew that, you knew what to look for. Therefore, when Philip told Nathanael about the Messiah whom they found, he did it from the standpoint of Old Testament prophecy. So if you're filling in, that's one of our blanks there. Philip found Nathanael, said to him, "We found him from Moses and law and also the prophets wrote." Next one says, when Philip told Nathanael about the Messiah whom they found, he did it from the standpoint of Old Testament prophecy. That fact suggests, like I said, that they knew the Old Testament prophecies and that they were students of it together. In all likelihood, they probably went to school together, being from the same small town, and the way that the education system was in those days, they would have spent time together for the first few years of their life studying in the synagogue with a rabbi, with a teacher. And throw this in here too, is something I'd kind of run across since last week. But, over and over we see where they look down on the Galileans in general and call them uneducated and all that. But a lot of scholars say that actually that the Galileans probably were more educated in the traditions and history of the Jewish faith and history than anybody else in the region, in the whole Jewish nation. It was very important to them there. And a lot of the big rabbis and famous teachers came from that region. They did a very good job, evidently, of teaching the young people about the old law, going through the Torah and those things. And then they were also known to be very patriotic and proud of their country. When we read about, and being a rural area, I kind of feel like it kind of goes with America today. Sometimes a lot of the liberalism we see and getting away from God and country seems to be in some of our bigger cities. If you go out in the country, more rural folks, they tend to be more grounded and rooted in believing in their country and believing in their God. And I think that was true in their day too, because when the revolt came that ultimately led to the Romans destroying Jerusalem and tearing down the temple, that started with Galileans. So they were very proud of who they were and very devout in learning about those things. So I think these two men had studied this together and knew a lot about it. So another thing we threw out there last week was that his father, Nathanael's father, told me he studied. We read from, not in the Bible, about some from history where we see that he studied and was a student of one of the great rabbis at that time, a guy named Aber, and that evidently then he must have been influential in teaching that to his son Nathanael too. So not only did he learn at school, but he learned at home, and the best students do that. They don't just learn it at school; they also learn at home. Early on when our kids were little, which I was a teacher, but my wife did a great job. Any kind of educational toy she could find, that was something that she bought for them to play with. And by the time they got to school, they knew how to count and write their name and do all the basic things that you should know. They pretty much had that down pat already. So, we're told in Deuteronomy that's how we're to raise our kids. We're to teach them at home. So whether that's, especially when it comes to religion. So I feel like that these people in Galilee were very in tune with that and following what God had told them in Deuteronomy about how to teach their kids at home. So I think they learned it at home, but also in their schools at that time. Nathanael was a very eager student of the Old Testament. He was already a seeker of the truth. So we see that he was looking for the truth. We kind of see that with all the apostles, maybe with the exception of Judas Iscariot, that to some degree they were already seeking the truth. Matter of fact, when Jesus called them, where were they? Well, they were in the wilderness with John the Baptist. So they had heard about John the Baptist and what he was teaching, so they wanted to go there and check out what was going on. And then, of course, when Jesus came walking by and he pointed out Jesus who he was, some of the first that would be called turned and followed right then. And then later, soon after, then Jesus began calling them. But best we can tell that Nathanael was one of those that was in that group that was also in the wilderness there, looking and seeking for Jesus. And I mentioned this again last week. There's a thing called frequency bias. And the fancy name for it is the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon. It says if you're thinking about something and you got it on your mind, you're more likely to notice it. And you may have noticed this before. You know, if you're looking to buy a new car, or you just bought a new car, and say you bought a silver minivan, and then like later, it's like every time you're going down the road, you see silver minivans everywhere. You know, I stopped the red light. There's one over there. I pull up in Walmart parking lot. Oh, there's another one. You know, you see them all the time because your mind is now focused on that. So you know what's on your mind, you're more likely to notice it. And the brain kind of takes care of itself. We're kind of designed that way to filter out things that are not important to us because there's so much information that our senses pick up on constantly that if we didn't do that, we'd be overwhelmed. So kind of God built us that way that if we're focused on something, that we're going to be looking for it and we'll see it. And I think that probably has a good bit here to do with the fact that Nathanael was able to recognize Jesus and see him when he did is because he had been looking for him. So when he saw him, oh, that's the guy. That's who I've been looking for. So he knew that promise. Nathanael was able to recognize Jesus clearly and instantly because he had an understanding of what the Scripture said about him. He knew what the promises said, and he recognized that fulfillment when he saw it. So it didn't take much, just a short conversation with Jesus for him to figure out this was the guy. Okay. Part 3. Now, the title of our study is Purely Prejudice, and that's kind of focuses on the negative about Nathanael because there's a whole lot of positive. But he's like all of us. He had his faults, and this was one. Verse 46 gives us an insight into what Nathanael's character was like in this way. So, although he was a student of the Scripture, and he was a searcher for the truth, and although he had a strong spiritual interest and had been faithful, diligent, and honest in his devotion, he was also human, as we all are. So we all, no matter how good we are, we make mistakes. And we read back through the Bible, some of God's favorite people made terrible mistakes. King David, he always comes to mind. You know, him being one who was one of God's favorites, but I mean, he did some terrible stuff. You know, he committed adultery and then tried to cover it up by committing murder. You know, so he was not without his faults, but at the same time, he had a good heart, and eventually he overcame those things. The same thing we see here. He certainly had his prejudices, and when he was told that Jesus had been found, what was his response? Can anything good come out of Nazareth? Okay, and that's quoted over and over, and that's always probably the first thing we remember when we talk about Nathanael was that statement that he made. Out of all the good things he did, that one thing, bad thing he said, is the one thing we see. You know, what could he have said instead? You know, we do that. I do that every day. I'll get in a situation and I'm talking to somebody about something or something will come up and I'll think, after I get out of the conversation, looking back on it, man, I should have said this or I should have said that or, you know, why didn't I tell them this? You know, I could have had a better response than I did. Well, so this was a response he could have had. You know, he could have said, Philip, as I read the Old Testament, Micah the prophet there says that the Messiah is going to come out of Bethlehem. I read that back in Micah 5:2. Not Nazareth. Or he could have said, Philip, you know, the Messiah is identified with Jerusalem because he's going to reign in Jerusalem, so not Nazareth. So he could have said those things, but he didn't. So what came to his mind, came out of his mouth, what was in his mind. We have to be careful, you know, because sometimes those things that are in our mind don't need to be said sometimes. We control our thoughts. Sometimes a stray one gets in there, but if we're careful about what comes out. But this time he let something out he shouldn't have. Like you said a while ago, can anything good come out of Nazareth? That was not a rational, not a biblical objection. It was just based on sheer emotion and bigotry. It kind of reveals to us what kind of contempt the whole town of Nazareth the contempt they had for that in the whole region. He was not unique to him. Prejudices and biases, we have to learn those. If you see little kids, when they're little kids playing, they play with anybody. They don't care, okay? They don't know whether somebody's different color than they are, or whether they're got a different amount of money than they do, or they live on this side of town or other side of town. They don't care. They're just kids. They just play. So we have to learn those things. And we may learn them, maybe taught, or maybe we just observe them. I'm an Alabama fan. Raised my kids that way, but I've never hated Auburn. I never taught that to my kids. But when one of mine was, I think it was Jordan, when she was little, very small, somebody offered her some M&Ms. And they gave her two, and she looked at them. She says, "Ooh, I'm not eating that." And I said, "Why?" She said, "Well, they're orange and blue. That's Auburn colors." Like, where did you learn that? But she had picked up on that we rooted for Alabama and we didn't eat orange and blues. So she kind of picked up on that without me telling her that. But that's how things get into us sometimes. We don't have to think about it sometimes just from the environment that we're in. We kind of get that. But the thing about Nathaniel is that he was from Canaan. So Canaan was just a little small hick town too. It was real close to there. It was even more off the beaten path than was Nazareth. It was one of those places where it was kind of a side trip. You didn't get there unless you were going there. Okay, I told this story before, but this summer I had to go to a workshop, and I went to Gunnersville. I'd never been to Gunnersville before. I was at the lake there, and we did some water studies and stuff for my science class. Really enjoyed it. Beautiful place. I always heard it was. But I punched in my GPS how to get there, and I went, and I was like, about halfway there, I thought, is this thing taking me to the right place? I had not been on a major road since I left Decatur. I mean, it's every little back pig trail, and to go here 2 miles and turn by this red barn and go there and turn by this creek. I mean, it was like, where is this place, So that's kind of how Nazareth was, except it was not pretty like Gunnersville once you get there, okay? It was just a dusty little out-of-the-way town. And like I said, Canaan was worse than that. It was off the beaten path particularly. So we said this in last week's lesson, week before last, but, maybe there was some civic rivalry there. We have a rivalry between towns. Probably today that has to do more with school and sports teams and those kind of things, take a lot of pride in those. And, we always want to beat our neighbors worse than anybody else because we have to live with them, and here it's, 365 days if we lose. So, we have that. I told the story, but when I was principal at Muscle Shoals, I had one of my young guys there that taught and coached with me. He was coached here, and he played here, and he was going on about not liking Florence. And he said one day about we were getting ready to play him, I guess was what came up. He said, if my truck ran out of gas on the bridge, he said, I would get out and push it to Colbert County before I would go back and spend money to buy gas in Lauderdale County. That's kind of how he felt about the rivalry there between the two towns just across the river. Where if you come from out of town, you just, a lot of people don't even know where one starts and the other starts. It's just the shoals, so they kind of lump them all together. But if you live here, that's not the truth, so there is some rivalry. And maybe that had a part to do with it. I'm not sure, but it was something that he thought and something that came out of his mouth. So in truth, it was a rough town in Jesus' day. This is a little statement here that kind of sums it all up. I read. It says the Judeans looked down on all Galileans, but even the Galileans looked down on the Nazarenes. Okay, so if you were from Judah, if you were from Jerusalem, the big town, you looked down on the whole region of Galilee. But if you were from Galilee, even there, you look down on the Nazarenes. Like, they're the redneck of the rednecks. Okay, they're the worst. So that's kind of how they thought in those days. So there was that contempt there for how he thought about Jesus' hometown before he ever met him. Okay, here we see that God takes a lot of pleasure in using the weak and the lowly, the common of this world to confound the wise. We read that in 1 Corinthians 1:27. He calls people from the most despised locations. He can take a flawed person and do great things with them, which is great for us because we're all flawed, and hopefully he can do great things with us. And in the end, the only explanation is the power of God, how he can take these people, especially these 12 that we've been studying about, and do the great things that he did with these people who had so many faults and were so, in the world's eyes, so unqualified for the job that he gave him. He just couldn't anticipate anything as great as Messiah coming from some place as lowly and common as Nazareth. But he wasn't the only one who thought like that. So while we're on this subject, let's talk about prejudice a little bit. We can learn a little bit about that. What does that word actually mean? If you just break it down in what it is, it means to prejudge. Prejudice, prejudge. So it's to pass judgment or to form an opinion on someone or something before learning all the facts. So before you even meet somebody or before you even know all about them, you have already formed an opinion about them. We do that, unfortunately. How many of us have been the subject of prejudice? You don't have to raise your hand, but just think. Do you feel like you've ever been judged by somebody before they even had a chance to get to know you? Maybe it was by the way you were dressed or where they saw you or whatever. I know my wife used to work for a guy when we early on in our marriage, and he owned a hardware and a lumber company. And if you saw him, you'd think he was homeless on the street. I mean, he drove an old beat-up pickup, always seemed like the same pair of coveralls with patches on the knees, and same old pair of boots that had duct tape holding the heel on. But he was a multimillionaire, okay? But he didn't dress like that. He didn't care for people to know that. He was just a hardworking, common guy who had made it in life and was just doing his business. But if you saw him, you would prejudge him. You would think this was not the guy that he was. Told this story before too, but there was I think it was a youth rally one time, a group talking to youth, but they got up and announced that they were going to have a guest speaker. They started singing and did a few things, and a little bit late, this guy came in and slipped in on the back couple of rows there. He came in, and he was a rough-looking guy, big long beard, long hair, some tattoos on him, just looked like a biker gang guy, and people kind of looked at him and kind of side-eyed him like, is he lost or what's he doing here? Maybe we need to keep an eye on this guy. Well, then they got up, and the guy got up to introduce the speaker, and he said, "This is our speaker." That was him. Okay, he got up and spoke. He was an undercover policeman. He was talking to the kids about drugs, and that's what he was there about, and about purity and all those kind of things. But, walking in a church building, he was not wearing a three-piece suit. The definition of what an expert is, a guy from out of town with a briefcase. That was not him, okay? He didn't look the part. So we're definitely guilty of that from time to time. People may have prejudged us. We may have prejudged others. Also think about some of the times maybe when you didn't prejudge somebody, or maybe somebody did not prejudge you, and what a blessing that was to you. For whatever reason. I can think of tons of times when that happened. I've told one here before about a boy that lived in a dorm when I did. I'll tell a different one tonight, but there was a guy that I worked with one time, and having coached and taught all over the state, a big part of the state anyway, I've run into a lot of different people and worked with some really, really nice folks. And one of them, when I went to Gardendale, my family, we moved there in the late 90s, stayed for a few years, and I taught physics and physical science, and I coached football and track while I was there. And I was a defensive coordinator, and there were two guys that helped me with defense. One of them was Willie White, and the other one was a guy named A.J. Young. Two of the best guys I ever worked with in my life. Two of the guys that anything I ever need, I could call on. Willie was a black guy. He was about 6 foot tall, weighed about 310 pounds. Looked like just a solid ball of muscle. Well, he was from Gardendale. Went to high school there. He played at the University of Alabama. If you're an Alabama fan, he was an all-SC nose guard at Alabama, and went on and played in the NFL for a couple of years. He played for the Tampa Bay, and then he played for the Steelers, and then he went and played arena ball for a long time. And he was still playing arena ball when I went there, and he came in to coach with us. But just a great guy. Well, one of my other duties while I was there was I was in charge of lunchroom supervision, which at a 6A school with about 800 kids, and run through there in about 2 hours. Maintaining discipline in the lunchroom and making everything run smoothly was a tough job, and Willie helped me with that. Willie was great with all the kids. He was always talking to anybody and making friends with everybody. He helped with the special education department on top of that. But one day he was sitting over the table with a bunch of little 9th grade girls, and I was walking around doing my thing, and he said, "Hey, Coach, come here. So I went over there. I said, "What is it, Coach?" He said, "These girls said I'm black." I said, am I black? And he winked at me. I said, and our school colors were maroon. I said, I thought we were all maroon around here. He said, that's what I thought. So that was Willie's way of teaching these folks these lessons, that we're all the same. And sports is a great equalizer. That's one thing I love about sports is if you're on a team, you're all in there to win, and you're in it together, And if you're the best man for the job, it doesn't matter what your economic status is. It doesn't matter what your color is. If you're the best man for the job, or lady, depending on sports, then we all depend on each other to get it done and to win. And, Willie was a great guy. And a lot of other stories about Willie, but he was just a fun person to be around, and a lot of fun. I learned a lot from him there, and it was a good time in our life when I moved there. We made some great friends. Went to church at Decatur Highway Church of Christ there. Mike Winkler was our preacher when we first went there. Was for a few years, and then later Miles Stutz at Atlas came in, and he was our preacher before we left. But Mike had a class there. He taught for young married couples, and we've been married about 10 years, I guess, when we were there, and it really changed my life and made me a much better husband and father, I think, than I had been the first 10 years of my life. So that it was a good time for us. So I have good memories of the people that was there. We do have prejudices sometimes against peoples, against individuals, classes of people, host societies. But that's a sinful tendency we have to overcome. Fortunately for Philip, for Nathaniel, it wasn't strong enough to keep him away from Christ. Philip said to him, his answer to that was, "Come and see." And that's the answer we should always have when we're confronted with some type of prejudice. Come and see. You're making a judgment without getting to know anybody or know their situation. Come and see. Keep an open mind. And that's how it was here. Confront them with the facts. Prejudice are feelings-based, subjective, don't necessarily reflect the reality of the matter a lot of times. So just the remedy of that is just being honest objectivity. Come and see. And as we study with people, you're going to run into people who have prejudice against the truth. I had a young science teacher I hired a few years ago at Winfield, and he was very smart, very go-getter type of guy, and I tried to talk to him about the Bible a little bit, and told him, he said, "Where do you go to church?" And I told him, he said, "Oh, my mother told me not to talk to you people because you'll confuse me." Okay, so he was raised in denominationalism, and he didn't want to hear what I had to say. He'd already been taught that these people was going to try to confuse you about the truth. Okay, so I didn't have much luck with him, but I tried. Okay, so keep an open mind. All right, next thing about him here is his sincerity of heart. The most important aspect of Nathaniel's character here is expressed by Jesus himself. Jesus knew Nathaniel already when he went to talk to him. He had no need for anybody to tell him anything about Nathaniel. He already knew. John 2:25, we see that. So his first words upon seeing Nathaniel were a powerful recommendation of Nathaniel's character. So we said, Philip went to him and he said, "I found the Messiah, the one we studied about, the one we've been looking for. I found him. He's Jesus of Nazareth." And he said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" He said, "Come and see." So he went to see. And before he even got there, before he spoke to Jesus, Jesus spoke to him. And he said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." And we read that in John chapter 1, verse 47. All this in that first little thing when they first met. "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom is no deceit." So there's a lot of facts and truth in that little statement right there. Behold, an Israelite. He didn't call him a Jew. He didn't call him a Galilean. He called him an Israelite. Okay, and that word "indeed" he put in there. That's very important. That speaks a lot about his character. He was pure-hearted from the beginning. He was human. He had sinful faults. His mind was tainted by some prejudice, but his heart was not poisoned by deceit. He was no hypocrite. To say that he was a true Israelite with no deceit, that set him apart from the majority of the Jewish people at that time, especially those in Jerusalem, and especially the leaders of the Jewish faith at that time, because they were hypocrites. And Jesus called them that many times. And if you remember what the word hypocrite means, it means an actor. So that's what they called their actors of that day, got up on the stage. It literally means one who's on the stage playing a part. So if you were a hypocrite, you were one thing, but you were pretending to be something else. And Jesus says that's not who this man is. He is not like the majority of the Jews that I've come in contact with. He is a true Israelite. He is no deceit. None of that is found in him. He's the real deal. He's genuine. He's sincere. He doesn't have any guile. The Greek word for that, indeed, is the word aletheos, or lethos, A-L-E-T-H-O-S, and it means truly or genuinely. He didn't mean here that he's talking about his physical descent, that he came from Abraham. Wasn't talking about his genetics here. He wasn't linking his status there without that at all. There were a lot of phonies living in that time spiritually. He was not one of them. Romans 9, 6, and 7, the Apostle Paul there says, "For they are not all Israel who are of Israel, nor are they all children because they are the seed of Abraham." So here we see Paul talking about this too. He said, just because that you are born into this nation, that doesn't mean you're really a Jew, okay? There's a lot of you who say you're the children, but you're not really the children. And in Romans 2:28 and 29, he writes again, "He is not a Jew who is one outwardly, nor is circumcision that which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from God." So, here he was saying, today we might say that, that's a true blue, red-blooded American, God-fearing, hard-working American. Not somebody who's pretending to be. Somebody who stands up and salutes the flags, knows the words to the Pledge of Allegiance, all those kind of things. When I was a kid growing up, small town, played sports, but one of our coaches there, our science teacher, Coach Glendon Gibbs, he was our head basketball coach there, had been head football coach for years. He was from the town, and he was hardcore, brilliant Tiger all the way. And we were in a team meeting one day, and I was a sophomore, I believe, but I was playing some. I was starting some, played on all special teams, and played a little bit on offense. Had not cracked the starters on the defense yet, but Coach Gibbs singled me out. He said, "Look at Scott over there." He said, "He's a true blue-blooded brilliant boy. He's brilliant Tiger to the core. You're always going to be able to count on him. Now, how hard it gets, he'll be there." And truthfully, I wasn't starting, and I was kind of doubting myself a little bit. And when he said that he believed in me, then that made me believe in myself. So when Jesus called him this, and he said, "You're a true Israelite. You're an example of what everybody should be," that was a great endorsement if you're called that by Jesus himself. And to me, that was a great compliment to be called that by Coach Gibbs, for him to say that about me. That meant a lot, that he had that much faith in me. And then after that, I'd do anything he asked me to do. I'd run through a wall if he asked me to, after that, because I knew he believed in me. And that's how Jesus was here, putting that thought and that belief that he had and labeling that on Nathaniel. He was an authentic Jew, one of the true spiritual offsprings of Abraham. Here was one who worshiped the true and living God without deceit and without hypocrisy. Okay? So authentic Jew, true spiritual offspring of Abraham, one who worshiped the true and living God without deceit, without hypocrisy. Jesus later said in John 8:31, "If you abide in my word, you are my disciples indeed." So again, that indeed, that same word there, alethos, he uses it again. So Nathaniel was a true disciple from the start. Very unusual, like we said, in that particularly rare in that first century Israel. And Jesus was known to say things that indicted the whole religious establishment, and this was another one of those things he said. But he was true, not hypocritical, no guile, righteous man, flawed as sin as we all are, but justified before God because he had a true and a living faith. So let's talk about his faith a little bit. Part number 4, his eager faith. Because his heart was sincere and his faith was real, he was able to overcome that prejudice. He had faults, but he was able to overcome it. His response to Jesus, that conversation, revealed his true character, we said a while ago. First, he was amazed, and maybe he still wasn't sure about Jesus. We don't know this. I'm kind of speculating a little bit here, so using our imagination a little bit. But, when Jesus said that to him, maybe he stepped back and he thought, are you just trying to flatter me? Are you trying to get me to be a follower of you, or are you just bragging on me? If you may have dealt with salesmen that way sometimes. They're going to act like they're your best buddy and known you your whole life. I had a telemarketer at school one time who called me, and it was like, "Hey, man, this is so-and-so. We up here in California. What's the weather like down there in Alabama today?" Just like we'd been best friends since elementary school. And then, like, Then they start pushing the sale, like, let me go ahead and let me get your address right here so I can send this to you. Well, I ain't even told you I'm gonna buy it yet. Okay, so I don't do well with high pressure salesmen, so I didn't buy anything and I hung up the phone. But maybe he was thinking that's how Jesus was. Here he's flattering me, saying all these things. But then Jesus said something that kind of nailed it. And Nathanael asked him, he says in verse 48, how do you know me? Okay, he had just been told about Jesus. He didn't know Jesus. And he was walking up to meet him, and he starts telling him what a great guy he is. And he says, how do you know who I am? So from that, we can kind of question whether he still truly believed. Didn't seem to fit the picture of what he had in mind anyway. This no-name carpenter's son from this little backwater town. No connections he saw in prophecy of him. But Jesus could see into his heart. Jesus answered then and said to him, before Philip called you, when you were sitting under the fig tree, I saw you. Well, that was not flattering. Immediately, Nathanael said, whoa, how did you know that? Okay, how did you know where I was before? This was way before drones and spy cameras, My daughter got us, one of my daughters got us this new little doorbell ringer. It's got the video camera, and you can see who walks up to the front door before they ring your doorbell. We got one of those now, So I know I can see them before they come. So he was like, they didn't have those back then. So he's like, how does this guy know where I was and what I was doing? He knew then this must be God, because only he could see where I was. Okay, and the significance of the fig tree. Let's get into that a little bit. It was significant. I was saying in those days, most of the houses were small, simple little, many of them just one-room buildings. And they cooked inside there and did everything inside there. And this was a hot place most of the year. So to get out, they kind of had an outdoor area where they would go, an outdoor living space we call it today, where they would go out and kind of sit in the shade. And that shade usually came from a fig tree. Pretty common for these people to plant a fig tree fairly close to their house. And it provided shade and fruit, of course, so dual purpose. But fig trees in those days, they only got maybe 15, 20 feet tall, but they were really wide branches. They'd go out 25, 30 feet. So it made kind of like a porch. So, where we live now, I love it. I mean, when he's talking about the other day, I said, but if we had a place, I really missed having a porch and having a back deck. We lived in Winfield, had a big back deck on the back of the house, big shade trees. I like to sit out there in the afternoons. I like to grill out there. Now I've got a little patio that's no cover, and I grill out there in the blazing sun. And I think I've got to get this thing covered at some point. I may have to plant a fig tree. I don't know, but I need something. But he had that, and they would go and sit out there in the heat of the day, and it was kind of their study. So they would pray there. They would read the scripture, study. It was kind of their place to use as a little office. So. Jesus is telling him here, I saw you when you were sitting out there and you were studying, you were reading. I know what's in your heart. Okay, and that's the thing we need to know about Jesus, that and that's a very comforting thought in some ways. That's also a very scary thought, is that he knows what we're thinking at all times. Sometimes that's good, like we said, sometimes it's not so good. Okay, we can't keep secrets from him. But he knew this about Nathanael because he had knowing what he was doing while he was sitting there. And like I said, not only knew his location, but knew his heart, knew what was going on with him. So it was enough here for Nathanael to say, says he answered to him, we're in verse 49 now. He answered and said to him, Rabbi, you are the Son of God, you are the King of Israel. So right then he knew and he believed, you're him. So based on all I've studied my whole life and all I've been looking for, I know only God's Son, only the true Messiah would know these things and can do these things. And that was enough to sell him. He knew that God knew his heart. Jesus answered then and said to him, though, he said, because I said to you, I saw you under the fig tree, do you believe? So he asked him, he says, is that all it took for you to believe in me? Let me tell you, I saw you under the fig tree. He said, most assuredly I say to you hereafter, you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. Now that should sound familiar to us. Okay? That one simple statement was not enough, but what he told him here was important too. Remember Jacob having a dream. Think about Jacob's ladder. The ladder, we see there in Genesis 28:12. The ladder was set up on the earth, and its top reached up to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And here Jesus is telling him, I am that ladder. I'm the ladder. You're going to see the angels ascending and descending on me. I am that bridge. I'm the ladder between heaven and earth. And you're going to see, if you think what I've just showed you something, you ain't seen nothing yet. So just hold on. Stay with me. Stay, and you're going to see a whole lot more than that. And sure enough, all the things that he saw through his life, saw Jesus do, it just strengthened him that much more. It made him that much more of a believer, which is kind of in contrast to a lot of his buddies, especially Philip. We said about Philip a couple of weeks ago. Philip came, he was, one of his infamous statements was even on the night of Jesus' betrayal on the Last Supper, he asked him, show us the Father. And Jesus was like, have you been with me for 3 years and you still don't understand that the Father and I are the same? Nathanael didn't have to have that. He knew from the get-go, from the very first meeting, I know this is God. I know this is God's Son. I know this is the Messiah. So he had a very strong faith, and everything he saw from then on just strengthened that. Now, hopefully we can have that kind of faith. Hopefully the things that we saw God do in our own life. I've never saw a miracle, don't claim to have. We see people all the time who saw the face of Jesus in a tree or in a figure on a door or something, and everybody will come to see it. And I've never saw that, and don't think anybody else has either. But the thing is just that God has worked in our own life. I can think of times that I have prayed for things. Sometimes I got them, sometimes I didn't. But the way that things have worked out for my own good and the good of my family, that God has always had a hand in it, and I can look back and see God's hand in those things to lead me places I need to be so that I would be in contact with people in my life that make me stronger. I talked about moving to Gardendale. I moved there because one of my best friends from high school that I played with in high school, he went there as head coach, and we had played together in high school. We had coached together at our old high school, and then he left, and I took over after he left, and then a few years later I left, and then we got back together at Gardendale. But, that was put me in a place, for one, I was able to go back, and I got my master's while I was there. It was close to UAB. That was before online classes where you could take classes on the computer anywhere. You had to go to class, and if you're coaching every sport and you can't necessarily drive 2 hours back and forth to class every night. But I was there, I could do it. And then I talked about coming in contact with some of the people there at church at Gardendale and the effect that they had on my life and helped make me a stronger Christian. That all those things I look back and see God kind of having a part to play and lead me where I need to be at the time, and some of the people that He was introduced into my life, and hopefully some of the people that I was able to have an influence on in some shape, form, or fashion there too. I had a player there, and had several I'll never forget, but one big boy, defensive lineman, we called him Big John, and his nickname was Swollen. John was about 6'1". He weighed about 350 plus probably. But he was a big boy, and we got to be really close. I had him in class, and then of course coached him. But it's Thanksgiving that first year I was there, and his dad was a little bitty guy, but he cooked for the team all the time. He could grill and cook like nothing. And John said, he said, "Hey coach," he said, "you going home for Thanksgiving?" He said, "I know you don't live around here, you don't have any relatives." He said, "You're welcome. Come to our house." So they invited me to come have Thanksgiving with them. We were going home. We always did, and spent a few days at home during that time. But just the people that you come in contact with, everyday walks of life. I really believe God puts those people there for us, either for them to influence us or for us to influence them. But who we are and how we got to wherever we are at station in our life today, a lot of people had a part to play in that. And God, I think if we're smart enough to listen and look, we see those things. So that's really all we know about Nathanael here from Scripture. Like I said, there's only 7 verses that tell us about him, but if we look at those pretty close, we can learn about him and what kind of person he was. Early church history has some things to say about Nathanael. History says that he ministered to Persia, Armenia, some of those places up in there, and eventually even all the way to India. And we don't really have any reliable accounts of exactly how he died. Of course, the Bible only tells us how one of the apostles died, but there's probably more cloudiness about him than any of the others. One tradition says that he was tied up in a sack and cast into the sea and drowned. Another one says he was crucified upside down, like a lot of the other apostles says the same thing about them. But one of the more gruesome tales about him, it seems to have gained the most traction down through the years, whether it's true or whether it's just because it's such a story, but that he was preaching in Armenia and in coastal India there, and he was able to convert the king of that region. And through that, though, that made a lot of other people mad, especially the king's brother, because he didn't want him to be influenced by Christianity. So he took Nathaniel prisoner and had him flayed, which means skinned alive. And of all the ways to go, that's not be high on my list. But, I remember going fishing with my granddaddy Key when I was a little kid, and we'd catch catfish, and he'd come back, and the fish were already dead, but, sometimes we'd nail them up to a tree and cut around the head and then take pliers and pull the skin off. Imagine somebody doing that to you, and you're alive. So that's one tale. And then he was beheaded. So not a very nice picture there. But there is one famous Italian sculpture in the city of Milan in a church there, and that sculpture is of a man like a lot of the others from the Renaissance period there that you see, really detailed with the muscular and all that kind of stuff. But it shows a man that you can see his muscles, his veins, all that, and he's bald-headed, and he looks like he's holding a big cape or cloth. But in reality, what that is it's his skin. And he's got a knife in one hand and the Bible in the other. And that's the title of that scripture is that sculpture is Nathaniel Flayed. So, that's one story about how he died. But, whatever it was, like all the others, he believed in God enough and had faith in the message that he was preaching that he was willing to suffer for it. We remember when the sons of thunder asked Jesus they wanted to sit on the right and left hand. What did he ask him? Are you ready to drink of the cup I'm going to drink? Are you going to suffer what I'm going to suffer? And they said yes. And he said, you don't know what you just committed to, but you will. And all of those men, all of them died a martyrdom death except for one. Talked about a couple of weeks ago. John, who died of old age, which may have been the worst death of all the others because he had to know and what happened to all of his brethren, all of his fellow apostles down through the years, and kind of see what they went through. And then his life, he was prisoner exiled on the island of Patmos, which was not a nice place either, especially for a fellow who was not in good condition. Wasn't exactly a comfortable place where you would go. Not one of these white-collar crime prisons they send you to where you play tennis. This was more like Alcatraz, where you were there with the cold and exposed to elements and all those kind of things. So Nathaniel, though, what we do know about him is that he was faithful to the end because he was faithful from the start. Okay, a lot of us may have not always been faithful from the start, me included. Okay, maybe we didn't get a great start to life. Maybe we made mistakes along the way, and prodigal son had to come back. But Nathaniel, from all we know about him, from that first moment he met Jesus, he never wavered. He knew who he was. He believed him, and he said, "I commit. I'm with you, and I'll go to the grave with you." And he did. So whatever he experienced after the birth of the church there, only made his faith stronger. And like I said, like a lot of the other apostles, he's living proof that God can take the most common people from the most insignificant places and use them to his glory. And if we don't get anything else out of these lessons, I hope we get that, is that living proof that God can take the most common people from the most insignificant places and use them to his glory. So you don't have to be famous. You don't have to have blessed with a whole lot of ability to be able for God to use you. He can use you in a lot of different ways. I said this, I think, a couple of weeks ago, but I believe this too. I believe that there's somebody out there that probably only you can reach. Nobody else. Not the preacher, not the youth minister, not one of the elders. Probably you. You have influence over that person. You may not know that, but you do. I've told this story before too, but my middle brother was a really good football player. I was not. I loved to play, but he had a lot more ability than I did. He's a big old boy. And we had some really good teams at that time. But I was on him then. I was telling him, I said, you need to be, and I was coming back volunteer coaching. I was about to graduate. and come back and coach full time. But I was telling him, I said, you're an example of these younger guys around here. You need to be a good example. I said, you don't realize who's watching you. And so we went to a little pregame meal. There's one restaurant in the whole town of Brilliant, and that's where pregame meal was. So we was over there eating pregame meal one day when he was a senior. And the lady who ran the restaurant, she had two little boys who were in elementary school, probably second and third, fourth grade, somewhere along in there. And they brought a little napkin to him over there while he was eating and asked him for his autograph. And you talking about really getting his goat. I mean, he turned 10 shades of red. And I was sitting there with him, and I looked at him and I said, I told you. You didn't believe me, but somebody's watching you. You're an example to somebody. Somebody you have influence on that they don't listen to anybody else. So we're all that way. There's somebody that we have influence over and somebody that we can reach. And every day, the way we live our life is a lesson. Sometimes you say what you're saying, I can't hear it because of the way I see what you're doing. So make sure what we're doing is something that's a good example to folks. Okay. All right. Appreciate your time and attention. Like I said, we got a couple more lessons left, and we should finish up about on time, I think. We'll combine a couple of hours next week because we know even less about some of these other guys. So, but they're all lessons that we can learn. So thank you for your time and attention. Have a good week, and look forward to seeing you back Wednesday night. Thank you.